When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. We are going to be talking about Winds of Winter, the likelihood of it getting released, maybe it won't get released, why that is. And this is kind of a question that I had from a Patreon. I kind of took their question and made it something I could actually apply to it. I will say, guys, if you do want to support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships and you do try to request a video, make sure it's something that like I might have some knowledge on, like actually in A Song of Ice and Fire, you know, because it's harder for me to do things if it's like influencing in Song of Ice and Fire, but I have no idea what that influence is. So yeah, I just want to put that out there. But again, I do want to take a moment to thank all the people that do support me on those other platforms, YouTube memberships, Patreons. I'll have those up on screen. But let's talk about Winds of Winter and why I think it's been delayed for so long. And if we don't get it, what those reasons are going to be. So I've talked a lot about on this channel some of the reasons as to why it won't get released or it's taking so long to get released. I still hold out hope that it will, but let's kind of put everything that I've done in the past and put it together. So let's think about just in the story, our characters. Think about all of the different characters, all the immense amount of stuff that has to happen in this next book to set up, if George wants to continue with it just being 2 books left, what those characters have to do. I think the 2 biggest offenders of this are Dany and Bran. Bran is a character that we don't know where George is going with the character. He is the most magical. He is the hardest to write. He is a character that is going to have to, A, learn how to be in Bloodraven's position, or basically controlling the knowledge of the world. He's a character that, how does he change as a character getting all this knowledge? How does he take that knowledge, apply it to the story in a meaningful way that makes it feel like his journey was worth reading? Because as of right now, out of the main POVs, I think if you polled the fan base, Bran would be their least favorite. I can tell this by when I upload Game of Thrones rereads. Bran videos always do the worst. I can tell this when I do YouTube polls. He's the worst, or the least, the one that people like the least. Okay? And so when I think about the character of Bran, George has to do so much to make this character feel worth it and earned. Think about the ending of Season 8. Season 8 had Bran being the king. People hated that because it wasn't developed. Bran as a character, they didn't do enough to make it feel earned enough for that to be the outcome, whether that was George's original outcome or not. And so Bran right off the bat is one of the biggest factors because he's so difficult to write. He has a lot of information that is going to be needed for the story to work as a whole. But if you think about where Bran is in the story, he's the furthest north. And by the end of this book, we have to have a lot of our forces coming together, probably not even in the north. So Bran has a lot to do in a very short amount of time. So then apply that to Dany. Again, I've made a video on both of these characters relating to Winds of Winter, but Dany is being captured by the Dothraki at this point. She has to either, 1, escape the Dothraki. Doesn't seem as likely. I think she's going to basically take over the Dothraki as their Khaleesi. So she's got to get them back to Meereen. She's got to fix the Meereen plot with getting the dragons back to basically under her control somewhat. She has to put in the next government while she's gone. She has to deal with the Sons of the Harpy. She has to deal with the slavers and the siege that's going on right now. She has to deal out with the fallout of all these new characters and people coming to Meereen, like Victarion, like Tyrion. We need all of that to happen, while we also need her to begin her journey to Westeros and or get to Dragonstone by the end of the book. That is insanely difficult to do. And how do you achieve that, right? Do you achieve that by, oh, you have flashbacks. So you go forward in Dany chapters and then you kind of flashback, tell us what kind of happened the last few days. We see this in Dany chapters before. This is not something that's unheard of. In book 1, this is something that Dany does like recount, right? She recounts events that happened prior because George didn't want to tell them on screen. Like, we needed to progress the story, so then in that point we could also then go back and tell that other part of the story. That's something that George could do. So right away you have 2 main characters that have a lot of work to do in the next book, and it's going to be very difficult to get them from point A to point B. But outside of that, we also have a ton of POVs. And I don't think this is as big of an issue. I know other people think this is a big issue. For me, it's not as big of an issue because when you think about all these POVs, a lot of them, maybe not a lot of them, but a good amount of them could get killed off in this next book. We could also see a situation in which we just start getting all these POVs together, and then you don't need to have all these different plot lines, right? Because it's more like, how do we condense all of our plot lines into maybe like 10 plot lines down to like 3 or 4? Like, how do we go from a Storm of Swords level plot lines or Feast for Crows level and Dance plot lines down to like a Game of Thrones plot lines, where Game of Thrones plot lines, you kind of had a couple to start the story, right? You only had like a handful. So that's what I'm talking about. Like, so for instance, when you think about book 1, you have Ned, Arya, and Sansa all in King's Landing. That all functions to tell the story of King's Landing. If you have all of our factions gathering into the Riverlands, eventually you're going to have all of them telling the same plot line, but just in different POVs. So, for instance, by like the midpoint of the book, if a lot of our northern people are together, like Davos, like Jon, like Mel, like maybe Arya at some point, if you have all of these, Theon, Asha, if you have all these POVs together, eventually you don't need to see as many of these POVs. Maybe we get 1 or 2 POVs of Asha, maybe 1 or 2 of Davos. Like, that's what I think. That part of it is like, yes, it's going to be difficult to get all of them together, but once George does get a lot of these POVs together, it's much easier to tell the story. But the POVs are an issue. Maybe a minor issue, but I think still an issue. When you look at where all of our POVs are, right, there's just a lot that has to happen. Arya is still in Braavos. She needs to get to Westeros, and then probably some stuff's going to happen in the Riverlands, and then meet up with the rest of our crew, right? So a lot's got to happen there. The whole Vale plot has to get kind of shored up. A lot of our villains in the story have to be gone, right? Roose Bolton and the Boltons can't be alive in the story when the others come over. The Freys probably will have to be dealt with, given that they are a main part of the transportation of our forces. They got to kind of be wiped out. When you think about other factions, right, you kind of almost think Cersei, she has to be off the throne at some point by the time the others come. Maybe not. Maybe they go or George goes the show route. But a lot of these things have to be wrapped up, and it is really all of that weight is being put on Winds of Winter. Now, let's think of some other stuff just outside of the story. When I look at Winds of Winter, I think it's a difficult book to write because I think when you look at George R. R. Martin's writing style, it seems like he had a pretty well thought out way of writing the first 3 books. And then after that, it seems like that's when the real gardening style started to kick in and have a big impact, because Feast for Crows and Dance, I think, are easier to write than Winds because a lot of it is reactionary to what happens in the Storm of Swords. Winds of Winter now is difficult to write because it's not a reactionary thing anymore. It's really taking all these plot lines that were built up in Feast and Dance, paying them off, but then also setting up the end of the story. So it runs into the really difficult problem that Clash of Kings has, where Clash of Kings has to be a reactionary book to book 1, but also needs to set up all the big payoffs of book 3. So the Red Wedding, so Tywin's death, so Joffrey's death, so all these big things that happen, Jaime's reveal, all that's gotta be built up in book 2, while also book 2 having its payoffs to book 1 and being a reaction to Ned's death, Robb's campaign, things of that nature, Dany hatching the dragons, like all of it's got to be kind of wrapped up in a nice tight bow. And so I think when you look at the first 3 books, I would say, and I would argue, Clash of Kings was probably the hardest one for George to write. I think that's going to be the same case here, because I've always said that the main series has a split. The first 3 are kind of the first segment of the story, whereas book 4, 5, 6, and 7 will all kind of be the second half, where they kind of repeat, right? Book 4 and 5, in a lot of ways, are very similar to book 1 in what it's trying to achieve. And so Winds of Winter is going to take on that role of being a Clash of Kings level style book, but just bigger, on a grander scale, having to do more and accomplish more in that set time. And that's a very difficult task to do. And then the last book is really just going to be finishing the story, right? How do you take everything that has been built up and paying it all off? You don't have to build up anything else anymore. It's just all payoffs like A Storm of Swords was. And so that kind of takes us out of the story now at that point. I think that's a lot of the main reasons that the story is getting delayed, why it's very difficult for George to write. But when it comes to George himself, why would George be struggling to write and finish the story? Well, for one, George is someone that now has come into a lifestyle of fame, of wealth. He's able to do projects that maybe he was not able to do when he was just trying to make a living. He's able to write video games, like Elden Ring, or he's able to start up this cinematic universe like House of the Dragon, the Dunk and Egg, maybe even the Aegon Conquest show. He's able to be involved in all of those things to ensure that his legacy goes with those shows, even though what should be happening is his books, but you know. You also have to build on the fact that, does George even want to finish his story? If you look at the way season 8 ended, it was a smack in the face, right? It was somebody else telling your story and doing it in a really poor way that damaged the legacy of that story of A Song of Ice and Fire. And so that, I think, coming off of Game of Thrones was something that was very huge that impacted George very negatively. I think George is also in a state of just negativity. You look at his last blog post that he posted, it's very negative, right? Talking about a lot of death, talking about the current state of the world. It's a very pessimistic way of that he is in, I think, in this point, and how he's going to write. It feels a lot like the Tyrion character in A Dance with Dragons, where it's just a very negative outlook on everything, taking all these negative spins and throwing dirt on it, really. And so you look at that aspect of it. You look at the fans constantly being on his case. You know, anytime he goes on Twitter to post anything, it's, oh, but where's wins at? Or who cares? I want wins. And, you know, I don't hate that sentiment, as in, you know, I want wins as well. But the way I go about it, I think, is different from those people. I think those people, you don't need to be constantly badgering the man about Winds of Winter. If we get it, we get it. If we don't get it, we don't get it. You know, that's just how it is. And I also find that I think George has become more interested in telling the history of his story than actually finishing and telling the rest of his story. Because you think about Fire and Blood, you think about Dunk and Egg, you think about the World of Ice and Fire. All of these things have started to creep up as Winds of Winter has not come out. And we've yet to see more and more details about it, right? We're not getting updates really about it at all anymore, right? About, oh, he just finished this or he just finished that. Even in the last year, it seems like he wrote almost nothing on this story. So if it is going to be delayed, or even more, or if it's never going to come out, it's going to come from a place of lack of motivation, where it's a really difficult task to do, and you're always giving yourself ways out, right? One of the biggest things that I think when you look at people trying to lose weight, losing weight is a very difficult thing because it's a completely different change of mindset, right? You're taking what you've been doing in the past, whether that's not eating, whether that's, or not eating right, whether that's not exercising, and it's changing that to do that, to put yourself on a schedule, only allowing yourself to eat a certain amount of things. It's a completely psychological thing to me instead of physical. I think a lot of people think weight loss and stuff like that is a mainly physical thing. It's, in my opinion, it's more a psychological, mental thing of telling yourself to have restraint and things like that. And that's something that I think George R. R. Martin, I think, could be struggling with when writing, right? Like giving himself excuses as to why not to write, right? Because of the things he sees on Twitter about Winds of Winter, because of this or that, because it just seems overwhelming because of how long he's kind of put it off. You then add that with the fact that he's a Gardner-style writer, so he could write something, right? He could write 100 pages or whatnot, and then completely scrap that because it goes against something else that he wants to do as he was writing the story. Feast for Crows and Dance Dragons are products of that gardening mindset, right? We talk about the 5-year time skip or whatever. That was originally what was supposed to happen, and so his gardening kind of said, no, let's not do that, and let's split up our POVs into 2 books. That's what happened. And so things like that could happen all the time, right? George could be sitting down, writing a Tyrion chapter, going, wait, this doesn't make sense because now I want to do this, so I'm going to take that away. And it's a good and bad side of George, because on one side of it, it allows some of the great moments, the great writing that George has given us throughout the years with the first 5 books and even his history books, but it also makes him a very slow writer. Because you also got to be thinking about from a mentality standpoint, if you're trying to write and nothing's coming to you, well, you're thinking, well, I'll just sit on it, right? I'll sit on it and wait for the idea to come to me instead of trying to force it or trying to just iron out what the issues are and what I could do with the character or characters, whatever is causing him an issue. And so that is another part of it that is really difficult to look at and go, yeah, that's why he's so slow. Because George himself, when he is ever talking to other book writers, he is someone that struggles with realizing that these people put out like a book every year. He just cannot do that because it takes him longer to, I think, process what he wants to happen in a story, and it changes so much. So, yeah, you put that into effect. So all these things are going on that would really give us a reason as to why he's not working on the story as much or finishing it. You then take that and you look at George's condition. Physically, George is not a healthy person. He's very overweight, which is going to affect you, right? When you start getting older, and, you know, I hope George lives forever, right? That's best case scenario. But looking at realistically, I am someone that can speak from experience. You know, I was a lot heavier, right? I was considered, you know, obese. If you go back to like the first video on this channel with me in it, you can tell I'm much different than I am now, but that's not even close to like where I was. But when you are that unhealthy, you definitely feel like you just do not feel as motivated. You don't feel like, you just feel bad. I don't know how to explain it. You don't feel like you can do things. In my opinion, that's how I felt. It's different for everybody else, but I think that could also be an effect of it, right? You're getting older too as well. Like when you get older, your body starts to break down. It's harder to do things and sit there and do things for like 8-9 hours and write a story. So all of that, I think, is a conflicting part of why George is struggling to write the story, finishing the story. And, you know, hopefully, I think I still hold out hope for wins. I think A Dream of Spring, if we ever get it, it's going to be because of another writer, or it'll be because of something down the line that we just basically get what George had already written, but it's not actually the full book type thing. Yeah, but let me know what you guys think. I also will say again, thank you to my Patreon, Mark Matthews, for you know, supporting the channel, and I hope I did a good job on the video. I know it wasn't exactly what you wanted, but I did try my best. So thank you guys all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.